This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Cassandra Olds, K-State veterinary entomologist, starts the show by explaining what insect pests cattle and horse producers could be dealing with. She also previews what should be prepared for next year. K-State veterinary toxicologist Scott Fritz progresses today's show by talking through a costly skin condition in cattle known as photosensitization. Ending the show is K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini as she explains how to harvest and cure sweet potatoes. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show discussing insect pest control in cattle and horses with K-State veterinary entomologist Cassandra Olds. Cassandra, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure as always.
Cassandra, what pests are we seeing right now?
Right, so we're in the tail end of summer going into fall. I've seen some leaves changing colors, which is impending doom for those of us who like warm weather, including our insects. So we've got our last of our stable fly and our horn fly population. Stable flies are predominantly in the spring, so we're not seeing nearly the amount of burdens that we get in spring and early summer, but we're still seeing a few, diehards out there. And then our big problem are our horn flies, which still have an active population. As temperatures start to decline, they're going to start going into their overwintering phase. So as we get to freezing temperatures, we'll see those populations go away. So it's still a concern, but they're on their way out for the most part.
Do they really need to go treat for those flies or just let it get cool and let them disappear?
I would say we're at the time of the year where nature will take care of it. Obviously, if your population is huge, 1,000 flies on an animal, go ahead and treat. But right now, with the temperatures, the cooler nights, it's also drying out. We haven't had too much rain. So when you have temperatures dropping, you have the heat in the midday, but the dryness, you'll start to naturally just have those populations come down.
And as we're thinking about these flies, are there things that maybe producers should consider to reduce them going to the next year?
Yes. So while they're on their way out now, I want people to start thinking about what am I going to do next year? And so studies that we've done have shown that if you burn in the spring, you can have a overall lower load of horn flies compared to burning in late summer and fall. So if you had a bad horn fly year, and I'm burning traditionally in late summer or fall, maybe it's time to try a spring burn. Spring burns will also be most effective in controlling your tick population. So thinking about the timing of your burn, if you're trying to do it to impact ectoparasites, spring is a great time. It's also a great time to look at what did I treat with this year, right? So we suggest an annual rotation. So year 1 using a pyrethroid, year 2 using a organophosphate, and year 3 using a macrocyclic program. And so main consideration is you can use ear tags, you can use porons, you can use sprays, you can use whatever you want, and you can pair them together as long as they're in that same group. And so in year 1, only you can pair a pyrethroid ear tag with a pyrethroid poron and a pyrethroid spray, and that's completely fine. So take a look at what you used this year. Did they all fall in the same group? And a good way to do this, if you don't know, is just type that active ingredient name into Google and say IRAC group or just insecticide group, and it will tell you which group it's in. And so let's say you didn't use best practices this year and you mixed a bit of pyrethroids with your organophosphates. Think about, okay, starting afresh, next year I'm going to use ivermectins and macrocyclic for my poron, and then go over the following year and start with only pyrethroid or organophosphate-based products.
And another fly people might be seeing bot flies.
Yeah, so I saw my first bot fly eggs out yesterday. That's the other, when the leaves turn and I see some bot fly eggs. And so horse owners will notice this primarily on the front legs, but also on the back legs of their horses. And they're just creamy little specks on the hair. And so the fly lays the egg on the hair, and the horse then, when they're busy grooming themselves and rubbing their faces on their legs, which they are wont to do, they swallow the egg. And then the egg actually doesn't get swallowed into the stomach. It's in the mouth. and then it emerges out from its egg, and the larva will actually penetrate the mucosal layers of the horse. So it's inside the month, and it hangs out there for about a month. So it's in the mouth, those mucosal layers. And then after that, they'll emerge out, and then you swallow it, which is why, I mean, people anecdotally, deworm for bots in horses after the first freeze, which is normally about a month after you see your eggs. And so instead of just waiting till the last freeze, keep paying attention to your horse. When you stop seeing eggs being laid, a month after that is when you want to deworm. If you deworm straight when you see those eggs, you're not killing anything. So you want to wait a month after the last time you've seen those eggs. I always suggest relying heavily on just keeping track of your horses, paying them a visit every day. If you've got eggs, it takes a couple of days for those eggs to mature and be ready for hatching inside the mouth. If you scrape those eggs off immediately, you're good. And so you scrape them off. Make sure you don't scrape them into an area where a horse is going to eat, obviously, right? So take them away from the hay area and scrape them off. And you can wash the leg with a pyrethroid-based product, but really, if you can scrape them off, and then just for an extra precaution, after you've stopped seeing eggs a month after deworm. But horses can manage a relatively low bot population without any ill effects. It's when we get the higher concentrations that you get things like colic. But you don't want to have them, even if you've got a low burden, you're just reseeding your population for next year. So it's best to stay on top of that.
So once those eggs have been scraped off, where should you put them? Because obviously you mentioned not where the horses are eating.
I mean, honestly, if they're just on a piece of dirt, they're probably fine. If you wanted to be super fancy, you could put a plastic sheet or a tarp underneath your horse's leg and scrape them off into that and dispose of them in the bin. I just kind of scrape them off. If you have a bot knife, you'll see that a lot of the hair comes off with it. And so you can just pick up that clump of hair and just throw it away in a bin or, somewhere where a horse can't get at it.
Is there something, if they don't get it caught and it does go in the horses, they can see something in their mouth?
So unless you have astronomically high burdens, you won't see anything in the mouth. These larval stages are incredibly small, and they're not there for very long. So you can, with high burdens, start seeing ulcers, but not really too bad. The thing where you will see ulcers in a horse's mouth is when we start getting blister beetles. And so this is also the time that we see blister beetles. And if horses eat those, that will cause ulceration and can cause a lot of damage. Often horses, it's so painful that a horse will just dunk its whole head in water to try and just cool off or calm down that irritation. Unfortunately, with the blister beetle, most of our insects we talk about, if it's dead, it's no problem. Blister beetles, dead or alive, that toxin will still cause damage. So keeping flowering plants down, they're attracted to flowering plants, and then they mate on those flowering plants. So we always say try and harvest alfalfa early so you don't get the flower. And then check alfalfa. It's predominantly in alfalfa hay. Kansas has caused a few outbreaks in other parts of the world because we've baled our hay and sent it off, and we have a blister beetle, a healthy blister beetle population.
And one other thing that livestock producers might want to be keeping an eye out for, lice.
Lice, yeah. So now, mostly when we go into winter, everybody goes away and I get a little bit of a break and the producers get a little bit of a break. But there's two caveats to that. One is lice and then one is the winter tick. So lice, although they're present on the animal the whole year, their population, their wave and their peak is really over the cooler fall and winter months. So you can see your populations starting to explode with that. You have to treat with something like a pour-on with that. And again, make sure you're rotating annually. And you have to treat twice because the little nits, the eggs, are resistant to chemical treatment. So you have to treat once to kill all the adults and the nymphs. And then you have to repeat that again. And it'll say on the label how often. It's normally a week or two. Again, to treat anybody who was an egg when you treated first. And so we have sucking lice, which take blood, which is a bad deal. And then we also have chewing lice, which chew off hair, leaving bare patches, which means that the animals can't insulate themselves very well. And so most animals can maintain a low lice burden pretty happily, but if you're starting to see bald spots and a lot of scratching, that's normally an indication that things got a little bit out of hand, and you go ahead and treat, and then those animals will be quite fine. And then the winter tick, so more prevalent in the eastern part of Kansas, has been found in the western part, so they're not completely off scot-free. So it's Dermacenta albopictus, winter tick. It is our odd tick that likes to be active over the fall and winter period. And so what we see them coming out now as things start getting cooler, and they will be active over fall and winter. They can transmit anaplasmosis. So here in Kansas, we have Dermacenta variabilis and Dermacenta albopictus. So we actually have year-round potential challenge for anaplasmosis. So just because you're in winter doesn't mean you are scot-free from anaplasma challenge. They're not as populous as Dermacenta variabilis, so most people don't encounter them. But if you are checking your animals in the dead of winter and you find a tick on it, it's the winter tick. And if you pull it off, you're okay. If you've got large populations, go ahead and treat the animal.
What does the winter tick look like?
It looks fairly similar to all our other ticks. You'll probably notice an adult in that they have a brownish coloration to them, and then the adult females that are blood feeding go that gray color. So predominantly we see the Lone Star tick. That's our most predominant tick, and that is very characteristic. It's kind of got it's more of a U-shape. It's kind of I don't know if you call it a U-shape, but a fat teardrop versus a skinny teardrop that our Dermacentas are. Dermacentas also have a nicer coloration. They've kind of got a mottled effect on the males, so a creamy browny color, whereas our Lone Star ticks are just brown, except for the adult female who has that one spot on her back.
Cassandra, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some insect pests that livestock producers might want to keep an eye out for this time of year.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
That was K-State veterinary entomologist Cassandra Olds. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we continue today's show by talking with K-State veterinary toxicologist Scott Fritz about photosensitization in beef cattle. Scott, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Scott, for starters, what is photosensitization?
So photosensitization is a disease in really ruminants. It's animals that graze green plants is really where we see the issue. And it's easiest to describe it as a really severe sunburn. Now there's various progressions of the disease. It can go from mild redness all the way to like the skin will actually completely fall off in really severe cases.
What are the two types of photosensitization and how do they differ?
There's a couple different ways to, break down the different types of photosensitization. The easiest way is primary, which is where animals will consume a photoreactive compound, whether that's through a plant. There's certain antimicrobials that can do it. Tetracyclines are a pretty good example. And the other form is secondary photosensitization, which is secondary to liver damage. So really anything that damages the liver that impacts the liver's ability to metabolize and excrete chlorophyll, you can end up with photosensitization.
Scott, what causes this condition?
So the first one, is if they consume certain plants that contain photodynamic agents, they will deposit those agents in the skin. They react with ultraviolet light, certain wavelengths, and it really damages the skin, which is the underlying cause. And secondary, there's a compound in plants called chlorophyll, right, and these are forage-based animals, and so that it affects the ability of the liver to metabolize chlorophyll, and one of those breakdown products is called phytoerythrin, which will build up in serum over time and be deposited in the skin, and then will react similar to the other photodynamic agents.
Can producers do anything to prevent the disease?
Yeah, so if you can identify the plants, specific plants that are the issue, and just either try to eliminate them via herbicides, just flat out digging them out if it's not too bad of an infestation. If you notice those plants are growing, preventing access. Otherwise, the secondary version's a little bit harder. There's just the list of things that can damage the liver is pretty long. And it's really not a really widespread disease, I wouldn't say. And even on a given pasture where you have affected animals, it's a small percentage of the population, but it still can be a financial burden on an individual producer.
What are the clinical signs of this condition?
So the disease really progresses. Initially, you kind of get some redness, maybe some swelling. The medical term is erythema. It'll kind of progress from there, and the animals will be pretty irritated and itchy. Pruritic would be the term we would use. You may see some weeping, similar to if you have a cut and get a scab, you get some serum that weeps out of that. The skin will scab over like that, and eventually, in severe cases, you can just lose entire patches. It's usually white-skinned areas with either no or light-colored hair that is most often affected.
What specific parts of the animal does this condition impact?
The main ones, like we just talked about, are the light-colored skin areas that don't have hair. So I'm thinking the muzzle, inside of the ears. The udder is a specific problem, especially in cows with calves on them. So if they get photosensitization and their udders become tender, they don't like to let calves nurse. And so you can have some pretty substantial decreases in gain of those calves on pasture, which is, again, a direct financial burden to the producer. Even there are cases where the tongues will be affected and they can actually slough the end of the tongue off, which obviously is not going to be good for an animal that we count on to graze. So those are typical areas that are affected, and usually the top of the body, things that have direct sunlight exposure to them. The underside is typically not affected because it's shaded by the body.
Can producers test for this condition?
There's no really specific test, but I think that's an important question when trying to determine if you have a primary or secondary issue. You would really be testing the liver function at that point, which I think changes how you would manage the disease. So if you've got primary photosensitization, again, that's where they consume a plant directly or a compound that is photoreactive. You can just eliminate access to that. Those animals should recover without a lot of input. The secondary version, where they've already got liver damage, you can measure liver enzymes in serum, and if you can identify liver damage, then it's obviously there's some other things going on inside that are a little more difficult to manage clinically. Those animals may have a different prognosis, meaning we may just end up culling those animals if it's bad enough. So really no direct test, but there's some secondary ways we can look at it. It's really, the diagnosis is just going to be based on the, visual inspection.
How do veterinarians and producers treat photosensitization? So
you're not really going to be able to treat, the actual underlying issues, like, remove the source, but treating the actual skin damage, it's going to be supportive care. Really, those animals actually get really sensitive to light. You're going to find them hiding in the shade. If they've got access to a barn, you're going to find them in the barn. And when they are out in the direct sunlight, it's very irritating. It's painful. They're probably going to be pretty mad and belligerent about it. So to manage those cases, you want to put them inside. And if the skin is sloughed off, you may need to add, some antibiotics to cover secondary infections. Probably consider some pain control. But if you can get them inside, then they calm down quite a bit. But it takes a long time. You can imagine if you slough off a big piece of skin, it's going to take a while to regrow that. So it's really supportive care and just, treating the clinical signs and doing the best you can to eliminate access to sunlight.
You mentioned before that this disease impacts lighter colors on the animal. Is this also a disease producers must be concerned about in their darker colored cattle as well?
We typically don't see it in darker colored animals. There's enough melanin in the skin that it seems to protect those animals, especially the, black colored cattle. They seem to just not be an issue. But if you've got, an Angus Hereford cross that's got a white face, then that white face is going to be where you see the problem. Even in just a straight Hereford animal, it's going to be the lighter skin. And if you look in the veterinary textbooks, the textbook image is a Holstein, and it's all the white-colored skin is gone, and the black-colored skin's unaffected. Typically don't see it in darker-skinned animals.
Is this a condition something other livestock producers should be concerned about, too?
Yeah, there have been reports. There's a disease syndrome in sheep called big head. It's more of a historical thing that, it's pretty similar. So any animal that eats plants that has to metabolize chlorophyll can be at risk.
Scott, the skin may seem like a minor organ, so why should producers care about this condition?
That's a good question. So there's probably multiple considerations there. One of the main ones is it is painful, so there's an animal welfare issue at hand there. If those animals do slough big patches of skin, they're more susceptible to systemic infections. Really, really bad cases, you can end up with loss of animals. And then there's the financial considerations. And so if you've got, if you start with the baby calf, if you have a cow that's got photosensitization on her udder, she won't let the calf nurse. You're going to lose weight gain, potentially have some health issues in the calf. And then you go on the cow side of it, if they don't recover from, early from the time of parturition through the time where they're nursing that animal, that's a pretty substantial metabolic demand. And if they can't gain weight during that time, we're expecting that cow to start cycling again to get rebred for the next year. And if we miss out on that, then you're starting to lose calf crops. So there's money lost there. And then you consider individual animal treatment. You've got time to manage it for individual producers, and time isn't free. Potentially cost of antibiotics, and just if you have to move animals off range, you're losing loss of grazing land too. So there's some financial considerations there, that go beyond the welfare.
Scott, is this something producers experience every year within the same pastures?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but I would say no. It's really based on, every year's growth conditions are different. The soil probably doesn't change a ton unless you fertilize, but you've got weather patterns, water, that kind of thing really can substantially change the way that the plant communities grow in a given pasture. And even year to year, the same plant, the way it was grown can have variable concentrations of whatever compound is the issue. And so I'm thinking from the secondary photosensitizer thing. So if you don't have the right temperature, water at the right time during the year, you'll have differences in the way those pastures grow. So it's not something that you see every year, and just because you had it this year doesn't mean you're going to have it next year. And just because you've never seen it doesn't mean you won't see it next year either. And so it's really frustrating. You can imagine from a management side, like, how do we deal with it if it's not something we see all the time? But it really comes down to balancing that. And so there's, the poster child is a plant called St. John's wort. And then there's a number of the other ones that can cause some liver damage, and that list is probably too long to list here. But, there's some extension folks there. The county weed guy might be the best resource. Really walking pastures, there's some applications that you can take photos of plants. You can even send them into the herbarium. At K-State, they're pretty good at identifying plants on images. So if you have questions, there's at least some resources to help you identify plants. And then you can do some home research to see if they potentially could be causing an issue.
Scott, where can people go to find out more information about this condition?
There's a lot of veterinary texts out there. Most of the textbooks, especially toxicology textbooks, will have a chapter on photosensitization. If you look at the Beef Cattle Institute's website for K-State, there's a toxicology tab on there. There's a document on there about photosensitization. Really, if you just Google it, the first reference you'll see is probably the Merck Veterinary Manual, which is a great resource. So it's not hard to find information just with a quick Google search, but, you can look a lot of places.
Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
That was K-State veterinary toxicologist Scott Fritz with information concerning photosensitization in cattle. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but stay tuned in because we'll be back with more up ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. The window for harvesting sweet potatoes in Kansas is generally mid-September to mid-October. K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini says the key is to harvest sweet potatoes before the first freeze. Cynthia, one of the things we were just talking about that you can throw in the air fryer and just cook them up very nicely. Sweet potatoes, I don't know how widely grown they are in Kansas, but you sure see a lot of them at farmers markets.
Absolutely, yeah. Sweet potatoes are a very popular crop, and they're very easy to grow, actually, because once they're established, they're very tolerant to dry conditions, which a lot of parts of the state are experiencing right now. So sweet potatoes are a really great crop to consider if you haven't grown them in the past.
The harvesting, I know that the timing is kind of crucial here.
Exactly. They are a warm season crop. So you don't have to pull them out of the ground until you notice that the temperatures are going to be dropping. You definitely want to get them out of the ground before that first freeze in the fall.
What are we looking at in terms of the actual harvesting process?
The main thing that you want to be careful of when harvesting sweet potatoes is you don't want to damage the skin. The roots themselves, the sweet potatoes themselves, are going to be established at the base of that plant. So your plants are vining out right now. And if you can get back to the base where all of those vines begin, underneath that is where the sweet potatoes are going to be. So you can take a pitchfork, you could use a shovel, and just dig outside of that area and then kind of work your way in, gently finding where the sweet potatoes are, and you can unearth them at that point.
We talked about the timing, but the longer you can let it go before that first freeze, the bigger they'll get?
Sure. If you want your sweet potatoes, if you want to leave them in the ground a little bit longer and let them get larger in size, it's not going to affect the quality or the flavor of those sweet potatoes, so you're perfectly welcome to do that. Typically, people are harvesting mid-September through mid-October, but if you keep an eye on the weather and you know when that frost is coming and you want to leave them in a bit longer, that's perfectly fine as well.
I assume you can eat them right away, but you might want to also wait a while?
Well, actually, with sweet potatoes, letting them cure is an important part of the process to get the best flavor. So when you first harvest them, when you first dig them up, you can leave them out to air dry for a couple hours, and that'll help protect that skin. We recommend you don't wash the soil off those sweet potatoes right away because of the risk of damaging the skin. So then at that point, you can cure them in a warm, humid environment, and that could be in a garage, it could be in a shed, whatever you have available, but you want that temperature to be around 85 to 90 degrees and high humidity, and leave them in that area for a couple of weeks to cure. After that, if you want to dust off any soil that remains, you can carefully do that, and then they're ready to be eaten or to be stored.
Are the ornamental sweet potatoes different than the homegrown sweet potatoes?
Yeah, this is a question we've been getting recently because our ornamental sweet potatoes are vining out so nicely and they're such lovely plants. People want to know, well, can I eat those roots too? And you sure can if you want, but these varieties are grown for the aesthetic value, not for the flavor. So if you do consume your ornamental sweet potatoes, you're going to notice that it's a much more bitter flavor. You would go through the same process of letting those roots cure before you consume them, but be prepared that it may not be worth that effort for the taste that you're going to get. What I would recommend instead, if you want to do something with those ornamental sweet potatoes, you could overwinter them so that you'll have them ready to replant next spring. So you could bring those roots indoors and store them so that they're protected from the winter freeze. Or you could cut the vines back and grow them as houseplants through the winter months and then move them back out to the porch or into the landscape next spring once the frost threat has passed.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist with information on harvesting sweet potatoes. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.